the breathless Victorian era. Picture this. A wealthy woman feels the room spinning. She reaches for furniture, vision tunneling, corset crushing her lungs, but she doesn't panic. She knows exactly where to go, her dedicated fainting room, complete with a special couch, smelling salts, and a maid ready to loosen her stays. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was Tuesday afternoon. By the 1860s, fainting became so common that architects designed recovery spaces into floor plans. These weren't myths. They were real rooms for women to swoon in private. But here's the question. Were Victorian women really that delicate? Welcome to Hearts and History, where we fall asleep to the past and wake up knowing more. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable, dim those lights, and settle in for this wild story about Victorian fainting culture. If you enjoy these bedtime history stories, hit subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And I'm curious, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Are you in bed? On a late night walk? I love hearing from you. Tonight's journey takes us into drawing rooms that cloud with anticipation. London, 1857. The drawing room fills with rustling silk as ladies gather for afternoon tea. They move with practiced grace, despite something crushing their bodies, corsets laced so tight they can barely breathe. Look closer. See how they take shallow, careful breaths, how they steady themselves against furniture. This isn't just fashion. This is body modification on an extreme scale. The goal? A waist so tiny it could be encircled by a man's hands. 16 to 20 inches, sometimes smaller. We're talking about squeezing a human torso into a space smaller than most people's thighs today. These weren't the supportive undergarments you might imagine. Victorian corsets were constructed from whalebone or steel stays, designed to compress and reshape the entire torso. Women began wearing them in childhood, training their growing bodies like bonsai trees. By adulthood, a fashionable woman might lace so tightly her ribs compressed, organs displaced, lung capacity reduced by 30%. Think about that, breathing at 70% capacity just to achieve the perfect silhouette. The pressure was immense, both socially and physically, and here's where it gets twisted. Fainting became fashionable. Swooning demonstrated refinement. A woman who fainted gracefully proved she was too delicate, too sensitive for harsh realities. It became associated with virtue and gentle breeding. Working-class women who couldn't afford tight lacing were seen as coarser, less feminine. This created a bizarre paradox. Wealthy women literally made themselves sick to prove social superiority. Picture the scene. You're at a tea party, corseted to perfection. The room grows warm, your vision blurs, you feel dizzy as your oxygen-starved brain struggles. But you don't panic. This is normal, expected even. Doctors were horrified. Medical journals filled with warnings about tight lacing dangers. They documented deformed rib cages, displaced livers, compressed lungs, digestive problems. Dr. Robert Carter noted fainting was so common among female patients, he considered it expected. Dr. Arabella Keneally published case studies of women whose ribs were permanently bent inward, yet the fashion persisted. Social pressure outweighed medical warnings. Mothers tight-laced their daughters from childhood, training bodies into shapes that prevented normal development. The tiny waist was culturally sacred, regardless of the physical cost. Something had to give. Enter the fainting room, society's practical solution to a widespread problem. When your household is full of women who might collapse at any moment, you need designated recovery space. These rooms became architectural features by the 1850s. Not myths or exaggerations, but real spaces documented in household guides and estate inventories. The centerpiece? A fainting couch with one raised end, one lower end, allowing semi-upright reclining while corsets were loosened. Upholstered in plush velvet, ornately carved. Side tables stocked with smelling salts, lavender water, fans, everything needed for a proper swoon and swift recovery. Think about this for a second. Society created entire rooms dedicated to managing the consequences of impossible beauty standards. Rather than questioning why women were fainting constantly, they accommodated it, made space for suffering, normalized unconsciousness as feminine refinement. The fainting room wasn't just furniture, it was a symbol of how far women would go, and society would enable them to go, in pursuit of the perfect silhouette. But this is just the beginning of our story. These mysterious rooms hold secrets that reveal the true cost of Victorian beauty. Secrets that might sound surprisingly familiar today. Form follows fashion. The fainting room emerges. So Victorian women are dropping like flies at tea parties, and society's response? Build special rooms for it. I'm not kidding. By the 1850s, architects weren't just designing ballrooms and libraries anymore. They were sketching out dedicated fainting spaces. Think about that for a second. The problem became so routine that contractors started including swooning rooms in their blueprints. Upper-class homes began featuring these specialized recovery chambers as standard installations, not emergency additions. Standard, built right into the floor plans like kitchens or parlors. These fainting rooms weren't random closets they threw together. There was actual strategy here. Location mattered. Ground floor usually, close to the main entertaining spaces, but private enough that a woman could disappear without causing a scene. You couldn't have guests witnessing the undoing of corset laces. That would be scandalous. So architects positioned these rooms where ladies could slip away quietly, recover their composure, get relaced, and glide back into the drawing room like nothing happened. The whole system was designed around maintaining dignity during, well, medical emergencies that happened twice a week. The centerpiece of any proper fainting room, the fainting couch. And these weren't your regular sofas. These things were engineered for unconsciousness. Picture a piece of furniture with one end raised, one end lower, kind of like a chaise lounge but specifically designed for women who couldn't breathe. The asymmetrical shape let them recline without lying completely flat, which would have been improper even while passed out. Some had curved backs that accommodated those massive bustled skirts. Plush velvet upholstery, ornate carved wood. They made swooning look elegant, because apparently even fainting had to be fashionable. But the furniture was just the beginning. These rooms came stocked like medical stations. Smelling salts on every side table, little glass bottles filled with ammonium carbonate that would jolt you back to consciousness with pure ammonia fumes. Lavender water for revival, fans for air circulation, privacy screens so the maid could loosen your stays without anyone walking in on the process. Some rooms even had special lighting, soft indirect illumination, because bright lights could trigger more fainting episodes. They thought of everything. It's like they were running fainting clinics disguised as sitting rooms. The maid was crucial to this whole operation. She couldn't just be any servant. She needed training in fainting protocol. Recognize the signs. Guide the swooning woman to the fainting room. Know exactly which corset laces to loosen for breathing relief without completely undressing her mistress. Wave the smelling salts at just the right distance. Too close, and you'd burn the nostrils. Too far, and they wouldn't work. Then monitor the recovery period, help retighten the stays, and escort the woman back to society. Professional fainting attendants. That was an actual job description in wealthy Victorian households. Wild. Picture a typical afternoon. Mrs. Hamilton is at tea, corset laced to 17 inches, wearing 20 pounds of fabric and petticoats. The drawing room's warm. She's been standing for an hour making small talk, taking shallow breaths because her rib cage won't expand. Vision starts tunneling. She sways slightly. Other women immediately recognize what's happening. They've all been there. A maid appears. Mrs. Hamilton gets escorted to the fainting room, positioned on the couch, stays loosened, smelling salts administered. 15 minutes later, she's back at tea. Tuesday afternoon routine. The crazy part, this became completely normal. Doctors were documenting multiple fainting episodes per week among their upper-class female patients. Medical journals published case studies of permanently deformed rib cages from tight lacing. Women's organs were literally being displaced to achieve that 18-inch waist. Some ladies fainted so regularly their families just accepted it as part of their constitution. The physical toll was documented, discussed, warned against by physicians, and completely ignored, because the social pressure to maintain that impossible silhouette outweighed everything else, even consciousness apparently. So here's what gets me about this whole fainting room phenomenon. Society saw women dropping unconscious on a daily basis and thought, let's build better rooms for it. Not fix the problem. Accommodate it. Make it comfortable. Dignified. Elegant even. But that raises a question that should make us pause. Was this really just about fashion and social expectations? Or was there something deeper happening to Victorian women's bodies? Something that made fainting feel like the only escape available? Because what we're about to discover might surprise you. The silent struggles behind the upright silhouette. Picture Margaret Whitmore adjusting her kid gloves one final time before entering Mrs. Henderson's crowded drawing room. It's Tuesday afternoon, 1856. Her corset laces were pulled especially tight this morning, 2 inches tighter than usual, because she knew the other ladies would be watching, judging, comparing silhouettes. Her maid had to brace her foot against Margaret's back to achieve that perfect 18-inch waist. Now, standing in the foyer, Margaret takes the shallow breaths that have become second nature. The real performance is about to begin. The drawing room hits her like a wall of heat. 15 women in heavy silk, their own waists cinched impossibly small, their cheeks flushed from the effort of breathing. The fireplace crackles, conversation buzzes. Margaret steps inside, her spine rigid against the steel stays that run from her hips to just below her collarbones. She can feel her pulse in her temples already, but she smiles, nods, glides across the Persian carpet to kiss Mrs. Henderson's cheek. "Margaret, darling, how lovely you look." The compliment makes the pain worth it. Almost. For 45 minutes, she's the perfect guest, discussing the weather, the latest novels, who's engaged to whom. She stands because sitting would wrinkle her dress and reveal that she's human beneath all that whalebone and silk. But her vision starts to shimmer at the edges. The room feels stuffed with cotton. Her heart pounds, not from excitement, but from the simple effort of getting oxygen to her brain. Margaret reaches for the back of a chair. The conversation around her begins to sound distant, like voices underwater. Mrs. Henderson notices first. She's seen this dance 100 times. "Catherine," she murmurs to her daughter, who immediately appears at Margaret's elbow. No fuss, no dramatic announcements, just quiet efficiency. "Come, dear, let's get you somewhere cooler." Margaret doesn't resist. She can't. Her legs feel like they're made of pudding. Catherine guides her through the hallway, past curious glances that pretend not to be curious. Down the corridor to a door Margaret has never noticed before. The fainting room. Every proper household has one. Inside, everything is designed for collapse. The fainting couch sits at the perfect angle, not quite flat, not quite upright. Deep burgundy velvet that won't show stains. A side table holds smelling salts, lavender water, and a small hand fan. The maid Sarah appears like magic. "She's done this before. Let's get these laces loosened, miss." Gentle fingers work at the stays, while Margaret's vision tunnels to a pinpoint. The world goes soft around the edges. Then, nothing. Just blessed unconscious relief from the prison of perfection. She wakes to ammonia burning her nostrils. Sarah waves the smelling salts away as Margaret's eyes flutter open. "There we are, miss. Just breathe." For the first time in hours, Margaret can actually do that. Her corset hangs loose enough that her ribs can expand. Air fills her lungs completely. Colour returns to her cheeks. She lies still for 10 minutes, embarrassed but grateful. This isn't her first fainting spell. It won't be her last. Sarah checks her pulse, adjusts her hair, prepares to transform her back into the perfect lady. The stays get retightened, but not quite as brutally as before. Margaret's dress is smoothed, her complexion powdered to hide any remaining pallor. "Ready, miss?" Sarah asks. Margaret nods, though her head still feels cottony. She returns to the drawing room as if nothing happened. The other ladies smile knowingly. Half of them will probably visit this same room before the afternoon ends. Mrs. Henderson presses a cool glass of water into her hands. "Better," she whispers. Margaret smiles weakly. This is just normal. Tuesday afternoon normal. What Margaret doesn't know is that Dr. Robert Carter is documenting cases just like hers across London. His medical records from the 1850s show fainting spells occurring in epidemic proportions among upper-class women. Not hysteria, as some claim. Not feminine weakness. Pure physiology. When you compress a woman's torso until her lung capacity drops by 30%, consciousness becomes optional. The fainting room isn't architecture, it's evidence. Proof that fashion was literally suffocating an entire generation of women. And somehow that was considered perfectly acceptable, even fashionable. Squeeze and swirl. The fashionable whys of fainting. London, 1890s. Dr. Arabella Keneally sits in her medical office, staring at X-ray images that make her stomach turn. Ribs curved inward like broken bird cages. Livers pushed down where they don't belong. Lungs compressed to half their normal size. This isn't from some terrible accident. This is from fashion, from what her female patients call tight lacing. And here's the part that really gets to her. They know it's killing them, but they won't stop. Keneally starts documenting everything, case after case of women with permanently deformed rib cages, spines curved from years of compression, internal organs shifted so far out of place that basic digestion becomes a nightmare. Some of her patients can barely walk upstairs without gasping for breath. Their lung capacity cut by 30%, maybe more, but when she suggests loosening their corsets, they look at her like she's suggested walking naked down Piccadilly. The resistance is fierce, because here's what Keneally discovers about Victorian society. If you can't faint, you're basically announcing to the world that you're common, low class, ill-bred. The ability to swoon gracefully becomes this twisted mark of refinement. Working class women who need to, actually use their bodies for labour, they're seen as coarse, masculine, unladylike. Meanwhile, the wealthy woman who drops unconscious from oxygen deprivation, pure elegance. It's completely backwards, but the social pressure is crushing. The cultural messaging is everywhere. Magazine illustrations show ethereal women with impossibly tiny waists, always on the verge of collapse. Literature celebrates heroines who faint at the first sign of distress. Being robust, healthy, strong, these become associated with peasants and servants. A lady should be delicate, fragile, ready to swoon at a moment's notice. Mothers actually teach their daughters how to faint prettily, how to crumple gracefully, instead of just falling over like a sack of potatoes. And God forbid you show any muscle tone. Keneally writes about patients who've never done a day of exercise in their lives. Their arms are like twigs. Their backs can't support their own weight without whalebone stays. The Victorian ideal woman is basically a decorative invalid. She needs help getting dressed, help walking upstairs, help with everything, because she's been systematically weakened. And this weakness, it's celebrated. It's seen as proof of her elevated social status. The medical community is screaming warnings. Doctors publish article after article about the dangers of tight lacing. They document everything: liver displacement, kidney problems, digestive disorders, breathing complications. Some physicians launch entire campaigns for dress reform, but fashion magazines just ignore them. Society matrons dismiss them. The peer pressure to achieve that 18-inch waist is stronger than any medical warning. Women would rather risk death than social rejection. That's how powerful this beauty standard becomes. Keneally starts seeing the bigger picture. This isn't just about vanity, it's about control. Women have so few ways to express status or power that they're willing to destroy their own bodies for it. The corset becomes this symbol of refinement, of being too delicate for physical labor, too precious for the real world. And fainting becomes the ultimate performance of femininity. It says, I'm so sensitive, so refined, that reality itself overwhelms me. It's tragic and brilliant at the same time. So when we look back at Victorian fainting culture, we're not just seeing medical ignorance, we're seeing a society that turned self-destruction into an art form, that made suffering beautiful, that convinced women their worth was measured in inches around their waist and their ability to collapse on command. Dr. Keneally documented the physical horror of it all, but the social horror that might have been even worse. Tomorrow we'll see how some women finally started fighting back. Ephemeral elegance, the high cost of beauty. Here's something that'll mess with your head. Victorian girls didn't just learn piano and embroidery at finishing school. They learned how to faint, properly, with grace. There were actual lessons. Instructors would demonstrate the correct way to crumple, how to let your knees buckle without looking clumsy, where to place your hand for maximum dramatic effect. Think about that. They turned unconsciousness into an art form. But here's the thing that gets me, most of these feints. They weren't fake, they were terrifyingly real. The etiquette guides of the 1860s are wild to read today. The Lady's Guide to Perfect Deportment actually has a whole section on fainting protocol. If you feel the vapors coming on, it says, don't just collapse anywhere. Find something sturdy to lean against. Arrange your skirts modestly. Keep your ankles covered even while unconscious. One guide suggests practicing your swoon in private, so when it happens in public, you'll maintain your dignity. They turned medical emergencies into performance art. And the scary part? Women needed these instructions because fainting was that common. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't all theatre. Most Victorian women were genuinely, physically struggling. Their bodies were failing them on a daily basis. Dr. Sarah McKinney, one of the few female physicians of the era, kept detailed records. She documented case after case of young women who couldn't make it through a dinner party without losing consciousness. These weren't delicate flowers playing pretend. These were human beings whose organs were being slowly crushed, whose blood couldn't carry enough oxygen, whose bodies were screaming for help. The performance aspect, that was just damage control. Let's talk about tight lacing. The numbers are insane. A natural adult woman's waist might measure 26 to 30 inches. Victorian fashion demanded 18 inches. Some women achieved 16. A few lunatics got down to 13 inches. Imagine wrapping a rope around your waist and pulling until you literally cannot breathe properly. Then wearing that rope 18 hours a day, every day, from age 12 until you die. Your ribcage warps, your liver shifts, your stomach gets squeezed into a tiny pouch. And everyone acts like this is normal, beautiful even. The medical establishment was losing its mind. Dr. Francis Buckle wrote in 1885, I have examined young women whose lower ribs had grown inward, creating permanent deformity. Another physician documented cases where women's organs had literally moved to accommodate their corsets. Stomachs pushed up into the chest cavity, livers compressed against the spine, and still the fashion persisted, because a tiny waist meant refinement. It meant you didn't work with your hands. It meant you were too delicate for physical labor. It was a class marker sewn into your skin. Then there's the malnutrition angle. Victorian ladies weren't supposed to have healthy appetites. That was vulgar, common, so they ate like birds in public tiny portions of bland foods, never showing genuine hunger. Many survived on tea, toast, and sheer willpower. Anemia was epidemic among upper-class women. Iron deficiency, vitamin deficiencies, low blood pressure from inadequate nutrition. Add that to the breathing restrictions, the lack of exercise because sweat was unladylike, and you've got a perfect storm. Their bodies were breaking down from multiple directions at once. Picture Mary Ashworth in 1867. She's 19, from a wealthy Boston family. Her corset measures 17 inches around. She hasn't eaten a full meal in public in 3 years. She takes shallow sips of air all day because deep breathing is impossible. At her cousin's wedding, standing in the hot church for 2 hours, her vision starts to tunnel. The room spins. She knows what's coming. She's been here before, dozens of times. This isn't weakness. This isn't feminine delicacy. This is what happens when you systematically deprive a human body of everything it needs to function. Beauty was a dangerous game in Victorian times. They literally sacrificed their health on the altar of fashion, damaged their organs for the perfect silhouette, starved themselves for social approval. And when their bodies finally rebelled, when they collapsed from sheer physical distress, society turned it into a performance, made it graceful, made it ladylike. The real tragedy: how many brilliant women we lost to this madness. How much potential was literally squeezed out of them, one corset lace at a time. Their elegance was ephemeral, their suffering was permanent, and the cost, their very breath. Unveiled, the hidden truth of the Victorian society. Here's what nobody talks about when they romanticize those fainting rooms. Victorian society created this impossible contradiction. They wanted women to be delicate, ethereal, almost ghostly in their fragility. But then they subjected these same women to bone-crushing corsets, 15-pound dresses, and social expectations that literally squeezed the life out of them. The fainting room wasn't just a quirky architectural feature. It was evidence of a society that chose to normalize women's suffering rather than question what was causing it. And that's the hidden truth we need to unveil tonight. Think about this for a second. When your solution to women constantly fainting is to build them special rooms to faint in, you've missed the point entirely. Victorian architects weren't designing fainting rooms because women were naturally fragile. They were designing them because the fashion industry was slowly suffocating half the population. But instead of questioning why healthy women were losing consciousness daily, society just made it easier. Built prettier couches for them to collapse on, kept smelling salts handy, trained maids to loosen corset laces. They normalized a medical emergency and called it refinement. The Victorian fetish for delicate women wasn't just about appearance. It was about control. A woman who could barely breathe, who might faint at any moment, wasn't going to challenge authority. She wasn't going to demand rights or independence. She was going to need protection, support, someone to make decisions for her. The tight corset wasn't just fashion. It was a physical manifestation of social restriction. Every shallow breath reminded her of her place. Every moment of dizziness reinforced her supposed frailty. The fainting room became a symbol of feminine helplessness, beautifully decorated and socially accepted. Here's the part that gets me. These women knew, they absolutely knew what was happening to them. Mothers would lace their daughters' corsets so tight the girls would gasp and plead to stop, but they'd continue anyway, because a 20-inch waist was worth more than comfortable breathing. Women would compare their corseting techniques, sharing tips on how to achieve maximum compression. They'd measure themselves obsessively. Some would even compete to see who could lace the tightest. This wasn't ignorance. This was a deliberate choice to sacrifice health for social acceptance. The medical establishment wasn't silent about this. Victorian doctors were publishing warnings constantly. Dr. Robert Brudenell Carter documented deformed rib cages in medical journals. Dr. Arabella Keneally wrote extensively about organ displacement and breathing problems. Physicians testified about women whose livers had been pushed out of place, whose ribs had grown inward, whose lungs could only function at half capacity. Medical conferences dedicated entire sessions to the health crisis caused by tight lacing. The evidence was overwhelming, documented, published, and widely available. The medical community was practically screaming warnings. So why were these warnings ignored? Because the social pressure was stronger than the medical evidence. A woman with a natural 24-inch waist was considered unfashionable, regardless of her health. Marriage prospects depended more on corset size than lung capacity. Mothers feared their daughters would be social outcasts if they didn't conform. Fashion magazines celebrated the tiniest waists, not the healthiest women. Society had created a system where a woman's value was measured in inches around her compressed torso. Medical warnings couldn't compete with marriage prospects and social acceptance. This is the hidden truth about Victorian society. They chose accommodation over change. Instead of questioning why their beauty standards were hospitalizing women, they built better hospitals. Instead of loosening corsets, they designed more elegant fainting couches. Instead of challenging the fashion industry, they trained servants to manage medical emergencies. The fainting room wasn't just furniture, it was a monument to society's refusal to protect women from a system that was literally killing them. They chose to normalize suffering rather than eliminate its cause. The Victorian fainting room reveals something uncomfortable about how societies handle women's pain. When the system hurts women, we tend to manage the symptoms rather than fix the system. We build better bandages instead of removing the weapon. Victorian women didn't need fainting rooms, they needed freedom from the social expectations that made fainting necessary. But that would have required admitting that their definition of feminine beauty was actively harmful, so they chose pretty rooms and smelling salts instead. The question is, what are our modern versions of the fainting room? Beneath the bodice, the medical implications of fainting. Here's what really gets me about this whole fainting thing. Doctors weren't just watching women drop unconscious and shrugging it off. They were taking notes. Detailed notes. Dr. Robert Brudenell Carter spent years documenting what he saw in his practice, and his observations are honestly disturbing. By the 1860s, he wasn't treating fainting as an emergency anymore. It was just Tuesday. He literally wrote that fainting had become so routine among his female patients that he considered it part of their expected constitution. Think about that for a second. Carter wasn't alone in noticing this pattern. Medical journals from the 1850s and 60s are filled with case studies of women who fainted multiple times per week. Some doctors started keeping tallies. Mrs. Smith, 3 episodes this month. Miss Johnson, daily spells after meals. The language they used is telling. They stopped calling it abnormal. Instead, they described it as delicate constitution, feminine sensitivity, refined nature. They were medicalizing what was actually systematic poisoning. These women were suffocating in plain sight, and their doctors were writing it off as ladylike behavior. But some physicians weren't buying it. Dr. Arabella Keneally published scathing reports in the 1890s about what tight lacing was actually doing to women's bodies. She documented cases of permanently compressed rib cages, displaced livers, lungs that couldn't expand properly, even when the corset came off. Women whose internal organs had literally been rearranged by years of pressure. Keneally found that many of her patients couldn't take a full breath even when undressed. Their bodies had adapted to chronic oxygen deprivation. This wasn't refinement, this was systematic organ damage. And here's where it gets even worse. The fainting wasn't just about the corsets. Victorian women were living the perfect storm for cardiovascular collapse. Think about their daily lives. They were told that exercise was unladylike, so their hearts got weak. They ate tiny portions to maintain those wasp waists, so they were chronically malnourished. Many were borderline anemic from blood loss during menstruation, periods that lasted longer because their compressed organs couldn't function properly. Then you add 20 pounds of clothing and squeeze their lungs. Of course they were fainting. The medical evidence was mounting, but society wasn't listening. Doctors published study after study showing the connection between tight lacing and health problems. They documented everything from digestive issues to reproductive problems. Some women couldn't breastfeed because their compressed rib cages prevented proper lung expansion during the physical demands of nursing. Others developed chronic digestive problems because their stomachs had no room to expand after meals. The medical community was literally watching women's bodies break down in real time, and fashion magazines were still promoting smaller and smaller waist measurements. What's really wild is how the medical establishment handled this crisis. Instead of demanding fashion reform, most doctors just managed the symptoms. They prescribed smelling salts, recommended rest cures, suggested lighter meals. They were treating the fainting without addressing what was causing it. Some physicians even developed specialized techniques for reviving unconscious women quickly and discreetly. The medical profession was essentially enabling a public health disaster because confronting it would mean challenging deeply held beliefs about femininity and beauty. That's some serious cognitive dissonance right there. The few doctors who did speak out faced serious pushback. Dr. Richardson published a book called The Diseases of Modern Life in 1876, calling tight lacing a form of slow suicide. He got hate mail, fashion magazines attacked him, other physicians accused him of being dramatic. Meanwhile, women kept fainting, kept damaging their organs, kept training their daughters to do the same thing. The medical evidence was overwhelming, but cultural pressure was stronger. It would take decades for the health community's warnings to actually change anything. And by then, generations of women had already paid the price. So when we talk about Victorian fainting culture, we're not just talking about fashion or social customs. We're talking about a massive medical crisis that society chose to normalize rather than solve. The doctors who documented this weren't just taking notes, they were creating evidence. Evidence of what happens when beauty standards become more important than breathing. Evidence that would eventually fuel the dress reform movement. Evidence that makes those fainting rooms look less like luxurious amenities and more like medical necessity. The question isn't why Victorian women fainted so much. It's why society let it happen for so long. Heralding health. The rise of the dress reform movement. Something's changing in the 1890s. Women are stepping outside. They're riding bicycles, playing tennis, taking long walks without fainting. And their corsets, well, they're starting to loosen. Not by choice at first, by necessity. You can't swing a tennis racket when your ribs are compressed. You can't pedal a bicycle when you can barely breathe. The tight-laced Victorian silhouette that seemed so permanent. It's about to meet its match in the form of real life. Picture the scene, 1895, a tennis court in Newport. Wealthy women in their usual 15 pounds of fabric and whalebone trying to chase a ball. It's not working. They're breathless after 5 minutes, dizzy from restricted blood flow. Some are still fainting mid-game. But here's what's interesting. They're not giving up the sport. They're giving up the corset. At least partially. Sports clubs start requesting that women wear reform dress for activities. The tiniest crack in the armour of Victorian fashion. Enter the aesthetic dress movement. Artists and intellectuals are saying what doctors couldn't. Maybe women shouldn't look like hourglasses. Maybe natural curves are beautiful. The movement promotes loose-fitting gowns inspired by medieval and Renaissance styles. Think flowing fabrics, empire waistlines, no corset required. It sounds radical, but it's gaining followers among educated, artistic women who are frankly tired of fainting every Tuesday. These aren't just clothes, they're statements about what female bodies should be allowed to do. The medical community is finally finding its voice. Dr. Arabella Keneally publishes scathing articles about tight lacing's long-term effects. Deformed rib cages, displaced organs, reproductive problems. She's documenting women whose bodies have been permanently altered by fashion. Other physicians join the chorus. They're not just treating fainting spells anymore, they're seeing the generational damage. Young women raised in corsets from childhood, with spines that never developed properly. The evidence is overwhelming, and people are starting to listen. Then comes the game changer, working women. Not the wealthy ladies playing tennis for fun, but women entering offices, shops, factories. They need to move freely, work 8-hour days, commute on streetcars. You can't type efficiently when your arms are restricted by tight sleeves. You can't stand behind a shop counter for hours when you can barely breathe. The sheer practicality of work life demands comfortable clothing, and comfortable clothing means loose clothing. The workforce is quietly revolutionizing fashion from the inside out. World War I delivers the final blow. Women flood into munitions factories, drive ambulances, work on farms. They're doing men's jobs in men's clothes, or at least clothes that allow movement. Tight lacing becomes not just impractical, but unpatriotic. Steel that once went into corsets days now goes to the war effort. Fabric is rationed. Suddenly, the government itself is asking women to dress simply, practically. The war gives official permission for what women had been wanting for decades, to breathe freely. By 1918, something remarkable has happened. The boyish figure is fashionable, straight lines instead of curves, loose waists instead of cinched ones. The Gibson girl's hourglass silhouette looks suddenly old-fashioned, even ridiculous. Flapper dresses hang straight from the shoulders. Corsets, when worn at all, provide support rather than compression. Women are binding their breasts flat rather than pushing up their waists. The entire aesthetic has flipped. Freedom of movement is the new feminine ideal. The fainting rooms are being converted into studies and sitting rooms. The swooning couches sold off or repurposed. What seemed like permanent features of wealthy homes, gone within a generation. Women who once couldn't walk upstairs without assistance are now dancing the Charleston, the same bodies just allowed to function properly. The dress reform movement didn't just change fashion, it changed what it meant to be a woman in public space. Sometimes the most radical act is simply allowing yourself to breathe deeply. Fading elegance, the final days of the fainting room. By 1900, something strange was happening in Victorian homes. The fainting rooms, once essential as bedrooms or kitchens, were gathering dust. Architects stopped including them in new blueprints. Existing ones were being converted into libraries or sewing rooms. What changed? Well, women were fainting less, not because they suddenly became stronger, but because the world around them was shifting. The death grip of extreme tight lacing was finally loosening, and with it, an entire architectural tradition was about to vanish. The bicycle changed everything. Seriously, when cycling became fashionable in the 1890s, women discovered they couldn't pedal in corsets laced to 16 inches. They needed to breathe. Sports were becoming socially acceptable for ladies. Tennis, golf, even swimming. You can't play tennis when you're constantly on the verge of passing out. So corset manufacturers began producing health corsets and sporting corsets, still restrictive by our standards, but revolutionary for the time. Women could suddenly take full breaths without planning their nearest fainting couch location. Fashion magazines started promoting what they called the natural figure. The Gibson girl became the new ideal, still corseted, but with a more relaxed silhouette. 22-inch waists instead of 16. Sounds restrictive to us, but for Victorian women, this was liberation. Medical journals celebrated the change. Dr. Arabella Keneally, who'd spent years campaigning against tight lacing, finally saw her warnings being heard. Fewer emergency calls for fainting spells, fewer deformed rib cages in her examination room. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Looser corsets meant healthier women. Then World War I delivered the knockout punch. With men at war, women flooded into factories, offices, farms. You can't operate machinery or harvest crops while corseted into unconsciousness. Practicality trumped beauty standards almost overnight. Women discovered they could work 8-hour shifts without fainting once. They could climb stairs without getting dizzy. The war proved something revolutionary. Women were actually quite sturdy when they could breathe properly. Who would have thought? By 1918, Extreme tight lacing was essentially dead, and with it went the need for fainting rooms. Existing fainting rooms found new purposes quickly. That elegant swooning couch became perfect for afternoon reading. The privacy screens made lovely room dividers. Many families converted these spaces into music rooms or morning rooms. Some became nurseries. Kids love those weird asymmetrical couches for playing. Real estate advertisements from the 1920s show former fainting rooms marketed as charming sitting rooms or intimate parlours. The smelling salts disappeared from side tables, replaced by books, sewing baskets or flower vases. Within a generation, their original purpose was nearly forgotten. Today, if you tour historic Victorian mansions, guides often point out original fainting rooms with amused disbelief. Can you imagine needing a special room just to faint in? They ask tourists, who laugh and shake their heads at those silly Victorian women. The rooms feel like museum pieces, curious relics from a time when fashion literally stole women's breath. Preservation societies work to maintain them exactly as they were, complete with period-appropriate smelling salts and swooning couches. They've become windows into a world where beauty standards had very real architectural consequences. But here's what makes me pause during those museum tours. Are we really so different? We might not need fainting rooms, but we create other spaces to manage the consequences of our beauty standards. Recovery rooms after cosmetic procedures, diet culture support groups, therapy sessions to unpack body dysmorphia. The specifics change, but the pattern remains. Society creates impossible standards, then builds infrastructure to deal with the fallout. Victorian women fainted for fashion. What do we do for ours? The fainting room disappeared, but the impulse to transform ourselves for acceptance? That's still here. Those empty fainting rooms in historic homes hold a quiet lesson. They remind us that what seems normal and necessary in one era looks absurd from another perspective. Victorian families built entire rooms around women's suffering instead of questioning why women were suffering. They normalized crisis instead of addressing causes. Maybe future generations will tour our spaces with similar bewilderment, wondering why we accepted certain standards as inevitable. The fainting room faded when women finally demanded the right to breathe. Sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to hold your breath for anyone else's approval. Reflections. An era breathless with beauty. So here we are at the end of our journey through Victorian fainting culture. And I keep coming back to one image, those empty fainting rooms in abandoned mansions today. Dust covering the swooning couches. Smelling salts long evaporated. But the questions they raise, still fresh, still urgent. Because when you really think about what we've uncovered, this isn't just a quirky historical footnote. This is a mirror reflecting something much darker about how societies shape women's bodies. Victorian society created an impossible feminine ideal and then watched women literally suffocate themselves trying to achieve it. The 18-inch waist wasn't just fashion, it was a statement. It said, your value lies in how much you can shrink yourself, how much discomfort you can endure, how gracefully you can collapse when your body finally gives up. And instead of questioning this madness, society built architectural solutions around it. That's what gets me about those fainting rooms. Think about the health crisis this created. Entire generations of women with compressed organs, deformed rib cages, chronic breathing problems. And for what? To prove they were refined enough to faint. To demonstrate that manual labour was beneath them. Working class women, who couldn't afford to pass out on schedule, were seen as less feminine, less worthy. The fainting room became a symbol of privilege, the luxury to be fragile when fragility was fashionable. But here's what really haunts me about those rooms. They normalized suffering. They said instead of fixing the problem, we'll just make space for the casualties. Don't question why women are fainting, just give them somewhere elegant to collapse. The fainting room was Victorian society admitting that their beauty standards were dangerous while refusing to change them. It's accommodation without accountability. Sound familiar at all? Because the cultural norms those rooms represented, they didn't just vanish with the Victorian era. They evolved, adapted, found new forms. The message stayed consistent. A woman's worth is measured by her willingness to transform her body into something that serves others' aesthetic preferences. The methods changed, the underlying expectation still there, still shaping how women move through the world, still creating casualties that society learns to accommodate rather than prevent. And let's talk about what Victorian fainting culture really was. The commodification of a biological response. Fainting became a product to be perfected, performed, packaged for public consumption. Industries built around it, furniture makers, smelling salt manufacturers, even etiquette instructors teaching proper swooning technique. Women's distress became a market opportunity, their suffering a fashion statement. Does that pattern feel uncomfortably modern? Because it should. Look around today. We've traded corsets for different constraints. Victorian women couldn't breathe. Modern women can't eat. They fainted from oxygen deprivation. We collapse from exhaustion, pursuing impossible standards through surgery, starvation, endless self-optimization. The spaces we create now, recovery clinics, wellness retreats, therapy offices, aren't they just modern fainting rooms? Places to treat the symptoms while the system that creates them keeps spinning. The Victorian fainting room teaches us something crucial about progress. Real change doesn't come from better accommodations for suffering. It comes from eliminating the need to suffer in the first place. Those empty rooms stand as monuments to a society that chose elegance over health, appearances over authenticity. As you drift off tonight, remember, you don't need to hold your breath to be beautiful. You never did.